My brother told everyone I was lazy while I worked 80-hour weeks to save our family business. When it finally succeeded, he sold it without telling me. But when he tried to spend the money, this happened. Let me start from the beginning because this is a story that still doesn't feel real, even as I write it. My family owns a landscaping business. Nothing flashy, but it's been in the family for decades. My dad built it from scratch in the 80s, and growing up, I watched him pour his soul into it. But a couple of years ago his health started to decline. He was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's, and he couldn't keep running things like he used to. That's when Frederick and I stepped in. To paint the picture, Frederick is the golden child. You know the type, always the smooth talker, always the one people seem to like right away. Me? I've always been more of a behind-the-scenes guy. I'm not shy, but I don't thrive in the spotlight. So when it came to dividing responsibilities for the business, it was a no-brainer. Frederick handled the big picture stuff, marketing, networking, schmoozing with clients, and I managed the operations. It seemed like a good balance, and for a while, it was. When I say I worked 80-hour weeks, I'm not exaggerating. If you've ever worked in landscaping, you know it's brutal. You're outside in the scorching sun, the pouring rain, whatever weather the universe decides to throw at you, hauling equipment, planting trees, and dealing with clients who want their backyard to look like Versailles on a Home Depot budget. It's exhausting, but I didn't mind. This was our family's legacy, and I wasn't going to let it fail. Meanwhile, Frederick was, well, it's hard to explain. On paper, he was working. He'd show up at the office dressed in his business casual best, holding coffee cups from overpriced cafes, and talking about his strategic vision for the company. He'd spend hours on his laptop, claiming he was securing contracts, or building our brand. I didn't question it, he was my brother, and I trusted him. But then, small things started to nag at me. For example, one day, a longtime client asked me, "So when are you planning to take over full-time?" Confused, I told him I already had. Dad had stepped back months ago. The client gave me a strange look and said, "Oh, Frederick told me you were still figuring things out." I brushed it off at the time. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, or Frederick misspoke. But as the months went on, I started hearing similar comments from other clients, friends, even family members. The narrative Frederick had been spinning was clear. He was the one running the show, and I was just helping out when I could. At family dinners, Frederick had this way of dominating the conversation. He'd talk about how hard it was to manage the business, how much pressure he was under, and how he was doing everything he could to make sure we didn't lose it. Meanwhile, I sat there quietly, trying not to let my frustration show. After all, what was I supposed to say? "Actually, Frederick, you spent last Tuesday golfing while I laid sod for 10 hours. There was one moment, though, that stuck with me. My mom was gushing over Frederick, saying how proud she was of him for stepping up. Then she turned to me and said, "And Edward, I know you're trying your best. Keep at it." It wasn't malicious, my mom's a kind person, but it was like a slap in the face. Frederick had her convinced that I was the slacker. After that, I started paying more attention. And the more I noticed, the more it didn't add up. Frederick would talk about meetings he had with potential clients, but when I asked for details, he'd get vague. He claimed he was bringing in new business, but the contracts were all for jobs I'd negotiated months earlier. And then there were the expenses, new laptops, business lunches, travel, none of which seemed necessary for a small landscaping company. Despite all this, the business started to do well. My hard work, and let's be real, the hard work of our crew, paid off. We finally dug ourselves out of debt, and for the first time in years, we were turning a solid profit. I felt this overwhelming sense of pride. I'd saved my dad's legacy. But Frederick? He started acting strange. He got quieter. His usual bravado was still there, but it felt forced. At one point, he told me, "You should take a vacation, bro. You've been working too hard." This was coming from the guy who once called me at 6 a.m. to complain about how I hadn't fixed the mower yet. It didn't feel like concern, it felt like he wanted me out of the way. And then came the day everything changed. It started like any other day. I showed up at the office, ready to review invoices and plan the schedule for the week. But when I walked in, something felt off. The desks were cleared, the whiteboard where we tracked projects was wiped clean, and the filing cabinets were empty. I called Frederick, but he didn't pick up. Then I saw the envelope on my desk. It was from the buyer, a corporate landscaping firm I'd vaguely heard of. The letter thanked us for the seamless transition and detailed the terms of the sale. Sale? What sale? I called the number on the letter and spoke to the buyer's rep, who explained that Frederick had finalized the deal 2 weeks earlier. The business, my family's business, was gone. Just like that. When I finally got Frederick on the phone, his response was unbelievable. "Relax," he said, like I was overreacting. "It was the best move for both of us. You wouldn't have understood, so I didn't bother you with the details." Update. After finding the buyer's letter on my desk, I went through every possible emotion. Disbelief, anger, sadness. But by the third day, the sadness wore off, and all that was left was this relentless drive to figure out what really happened. The whole thing just didn't add up. First off, the timing was weird. Frederick had sold the business 2 weeks before I even found out. That meant he'd been walking around for 14 days, acting completely normal, while keeping this massive secret. He'd even invited me over for dinner one of those nights, where he casually asked, "How's work going?" Like nothing had changed. Who does that? And then there was the money. The buyer's letter didn't say how much the business sold for, which struck me as odd. A company buying another company is usually eager to brag about how much they spent. So, where was the figure? That's when I decided to go digging. If Frederick thought he could just sell the business and walk away scot-free, he clearly didn't know me as well as he thought. I started with the company records. I had access to some of the documents since I was technically still a co-owner, though Frederick handled most of the paperwork. When I opened our accounting software, I nearly slammed my laptop shut out of frustration. It was a mess. Half the files were mislabeled or missing entirely. It was like Frederick had gone out of his way to make everything as confusing as possible. But I kept at it because I knew there had to be something there. And I was right. It started small. I found a series of payments marked as consulting fees. At first, I didn't think much of it. We occasionally hired outside help, like web designers or marketing consultants. But the amounts were odd, thousands of dollars at a time, and the payments didn't line up with any work I remembered approving. That's when I noticed the recipient of these payments, a company called F&F Ventures. The name didn't ring any bells, so I Googled it. Nothing came up. No website, no business listing. It didn't exist. Or at least, not in the way Frederick wanted me to think it did. I kept digging, and what I found was worse than I expected. F&F Ventures wasn't a legitimate consulting firm. It was a shell company Frederick had set up years ago. I found the LLC registration in his name and everything. For years, he'd been siphoning off money from the business, paying it into his fake company, and pocketing it. And it wasn't just a few bucks here and there, he'd taken tens of thousands of dollars. At this point, I wasn't just angry, I was livid. I'd been working 80-hour weeks, busting my ass to keep the business afloat, while Frederick treated it like his personal ATM. And the worst part? He'd been so smug about it. All those times he bragged about running the company, or making sacrifices, it was all a lie. Before confronting Frederick, I decided to tell my parents. I figured they had a right to know what was going on, especially since this was their business originally. But I wasn't prepared for how that conversation would go. I sat them down and explained everything. How Frederick sold the business without telling me, how he'd been stealing money for years. My dad was furious. He's an old-school, hard-working guy, and the idea of Frederick stealing from the family was a betrayal he couldn't wrap his head around. My mom, on the other hand, was conflicted. "Are you sure you're not just misunderstanding something?" she asked. Frederick's always had good intentions. I couldn't believe it. Good intentions? He stole from us and sold our legacy. But Frederick's charm is a weapon, and he'd clearly used it to paint himself as the hero of this story. I realized then that if I wanted justice, I couldn't rely on anyone else to take my side. I had to handle this myself. I finally confronted Frederick one evening. I didn't call or text him. I wanted to see his face when I laid it all out. So, I showed up at his condo, unannounced, with a folder full of evidence. When he opened the door, he looked surprised but not worried. That smug confidence of his hadn't wavered. "What's up?" he asked casually, like we were just catching up. I didn't waste time. I walked past him, dropped the folder on his dining table and said, "Care to explain this?" He flipped through the papers, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up and said, "You're overreacting. It's not as bad as it looks." Not as bad as it looks? The audacity was unreal. I pointed out the payments to F&F Ventures, the shell company, the missing records. And do you know what he said? "I needed that money to keep the business running. You wouldn't understand. You're not a big picture guy." I couldn't believe it. He was still spinning this narrative that he was the mastermind behind everything, that I was just some clueless grunt. I told him I was done listening to his excuses and that he'd be hearing from my lawyer. For the first time, his mask slipped. "You're seriously going to make this a legal thing?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "We're family, Edward. You don't go to war with your own blood. Family doesn't steal from each other," I shot back. "You made this a legal thing when you sold the business behind my back." After that confrontation, I called up Ashley, an attorney I've known for years. She's smart, no nonsense, and not afraid to take on a challenge. When I explained the situation, she told me we might have a case. Apparently, there's a clause in most business sale agreements that requires all co-owners to sign off on the deal. If Frederick misrepresented his authority, the sale could be voided, or at least challenged. Ashley also said we could pursue him for breach of fiduciary duty, especially since I had evidence of his embezzlement. Hearing that gave me a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just going to sit back and let Frederick get away with this. A few days later, Ashley called me with an update. She'd spoken to the buyer's legal team, and they were concerned. It turned out Frederick had misled them too, claiming I'd approved the sale when I hadn't. The buyer was now reconsidering the entire deal, and Frederick was starting to panic. And that's when I realized I had leverage. For the first time since this whole mess began, I felt like I had some control. Frederick had spent years building this house of cards, and it was about to come crashing down. Final update. After my lawyer, Ashley, told me we had leverage, things started moving fast. The buyer, clearly spooked by the legal mess Frederick had created, froze the sale proceeds in escrow. This meant that Frederick, who probably thought he'd be living it up by now, suddenly couldn't access the money. And let me tell you, the timing couldn't have been better. I didn't confront him again right away. I wanted him to stew for a bit. Every time I thought about the years I'd spent working myself into the ground for our family business, only for Frederick to betray me like this, my anger burned hotter. But I kept it under control because I knew this wasn't just about emotions, it was about strategy. In the meantime, I kept digging. I wasn't just looking for more evidence of his embezzlement, I wanted to know why. Why would he do this? Was it just greed? Or was there something else driving him? That question kept me up at night, even as Ashley and I prepped for what was shaping up to be a nasty legal battle. The first sign that Frederick was feeling the pressure came about a week after the buyer froze the funds. I got a call from our mom, who sounded worried. Apparently, Frederick had been acting off, more irritable than usual, snapping at people over nothing, and avoiding family dinners. My mom said he'd been spending a lot of time at home, which was unusual for him. I think he's stressed or she said. Maybe you two should talk. I bit my tongue so hard I thought I'd taste blood. Talk? After what he did? But I just told her I'd think about it and hung up. I wasn't ready to confront him yet. Not until I had all my ducks in a row. Then, something weird happened. I was at the grocery store, picking up some stuff for dinner, when I ran into one of our old clients. We got to talking, and he casually mentioned that he'd heard Frederick was starting a new venture. My ears perked up immediately. What kind of venture? I asked. The guy shrugged and said Frederick had been dropping hints about a big project but didn't go into details. I thanked him and walked away, my mind racing. A new venture? With what money? He couldn't access the funds from the sale, so where was he planning to get the cash for this big project? That's when I realized Frederick must have had other plans in motion, plans that didn't rely solely on the sale proceeds. I went back through the financial records, looking for anything I might have missed. And that's when I found it. A series of loans taken out in the company's name over the past 2 years. I'd seen them before but assumed they were legitimate business expenses. But when I looked closer, I realized the funds hadn't been used for the business at all. Instead, the money had been transferred into a separate account, the same account Frederick had been using for his fake consulting company. My stomach turned. Not only had he been stealing from the business, but he'd also been using it to secure loans that he then pocketed. And since the loans were tied to the business, I was technically on the hook for half of them. That was my breaking point. I called Ashley and told her everything. He didn't just screw you over, she said. He's put himself in a legal minefield. We can use this. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Ashley filed a lawsuit against Frederick for breach of fiduciary duty, embezzlement, and fraud. The evidence we had was rock solid. Bank records, fake invoices, loan documents, and Frederick didn't stand a chance. The buyer, wanting to avoid any association with the mess Frederick had created, decided to void the sale entirely. This was huge. Not only did it mean Frederick wouldn't see a dime from the sale, but it also meant I had a chance to reclaim the business. It wouldn't be easy, I'd still have to deal with the loans he'd taken out, but it was something. A chance to rebuild. Frederick, meanwhile, was spiraling. He tried to play it cool at first, acting like the lawsuit was just a minor inconvenience. But as the court dates loomed and more evidence came to light, his confidence started to crack. He stopped returning my calls and emails, and the few times I saw him in person, he looked different. The polished, cocky version of my brother had been replaced by someone who looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. The tipping point came during the deposition. Ashley had been grilling Frederick for hours, going through every detail of his financial schemes. At one point, she asked him a simple question. Why didn't you just ask your brother for help if you needed money? Frederick hesitated. For a moment, I thought he might actually admit to being in over his head. But instead, he looked straight at me and said, because he wouldn't have understood. He never saw the big picture. I wanted to laugh. The sheer arrogance of that statement, even after everything he'd done, was mind-blowing. But I stayed quiet and let Ashley do her job. In the end, the court ruled in my favor. Frederick was ordered to repay the money he'd stolen, including the loan amounts, and the buyer officially returned ownership of the business to me. It wasn't a perfect victory, I still had a mountain of debt to deal with, but it was enough. Frederick, on the other hand, walked away with nothing. His bank accounts were frozen, his reputation was in shambles, and even our parents, who had initially tried to stay neutral, were furious with him. It's been a few months now, and things are starting to stabilize. I've been working hard to rebuild the business, and while it's still a work in progress, I'm proud of how far we've come. As for Frederick, last I heard, he's been couch surfing and trying to start over in another city. I'd be lying if I said I felt bad for him. He made his choices, and now he's living with the consequences.